Hey everyone, Tatum here, and welcome to our podcast. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out that while recording our first few episodes, we were still working out a few logistics, so please bear with us. One that you will quickly notice is that, as you can hear, I now have a better mic than I did when we recorded our Inception episode, so going forward, you should have much better audio quality. Additionally, as it took us a few episodes to figure out the specifics of our format, you will find that our first 3 episodes include step-by-step plot summaries that we do eliminate by episode 4. Anyway, enough about all of that boring shenanigans. We thank you for your patience as we start this super fun project, and we are so happy to have you on this journey with us. So, without further ado, let's get started.
You're waiting for a train that'll take you far away. You know where you hope this train will take you, but you can't know for sure. But it doesn't matter. How can it not matter?
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
Welcome to the Your Pick Movie Podcast. I'm Geneva.
And I'm Tatum.
We're 2 friends who love the movies and love sharing them with each other. Each week, we take turns picking a film that is close to our hearts and talk about why it moves us, to tears, to laughter, and everything in between. We celebrate the craft of filmmaking, as well as the unique and personal ways we find meaning in the movies we watch. So, this is the first episode of this podcast, and I thought Woo! So I thought we'd take a couple of minutes to just introduce ourselves a little bit and talk about our relationship to movies. So I'm Geneva. I grew up in a family where movies are definitely a big pastime. I have an uncle who loves old film and has this like massive old DVD collection, and he introduced me to a lot of stuff when I was growing up. So I've kind of just always been kind of an old movie buff. I started getting in college, I started getting more into film on my own. I was renting a lot of movies, trying to start getting really serious about filling in gaps in my, in what I'd watched and really thinking critically about film. I started taking screenwriting classes and filmmaking classes, things like that. And after college, I went to Los Angeles, and I interned out in Los Angeles for a couple of sort of production and talent management companies for several months. So that was fascinating, because I was just basically reading scripts the entire time and just, observing how things worked, things like that. Since then I've not been working in the film industry, but I've just continued to watch a lot of films, read a lot about film criticism in particular. That's kind of an area that I'm really fascinated by. I really love analyzing and thinking deeply about film. I actually just finished up a master's degree in theology and the arts with a research focus on film. So I was reading a lot of film criticism, a lot of kind of academic work about film studies, and in the process of writing my dissertation for that. So yeah, that's me, me and the movies. Tatum, what about you?
Yeah, so I've kind of always loved movies as long as I can remember. I grew up in a family where we always had something on the TV or music or something. We always loved having stimulation in the house. And actually, my dad showed me a lot of movies when I was younger. And I think the love of film was kind of always in me, but I didn't fully, just go all in with it until I was in my late teens and college years. I made movies all the time with my neighbors growing up. I was interested in claymation and like behind the scenes theater stuff. And then in college, I actually studied film. And then I was able to start learning the process of studying films and how they're made and why they're shot that way, as well as studying and writing film criticism. And then when I graduated college, I started working in the film industry. I've worked in lots of different roles. I started as a carpenter, and then from there I've done mostly props and set dressing. I'm sure I will explain those things to people as time goes on, because a lot of people don't know what set dressing is, but that's fine. And yeah, I also, I'm a screenwriter, director. I've written some shorts. I wrote a feature last year. I made and finished a short a few years back. And yeah, so that's kind of my relationship to film. I watch so many movies all the time. The type of films that I watch, the genre that I typically gravitate towards is different from Geneva's most of the time, which is really fun for this podcast. I think it's going to be interesting as we share films with each other that are very different. And sometimes I like films that Geneva does not like, and vice versa. But we always love to talk about it. So that's why we're here. Our friendship kind of started back a few years ago, and we kind of met each other. And I think I invited you to see a movie, Geneva. I think we went to go see, was it Manchester by the Sea? I don't remember. But I think I invited you to go see. We'll be talking about that movie at some point.
Yeah, we should try and remember what it was. What was the first movie we watched together? Because
I don't remember. It was Manchester by the Sea.
I don't remember. It was definitely that year. So it was.
Yeah, it's like, hey, let's become friends and watch one of the most like upsetting movies to ever exist.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we saw that, and then I think we both kind of realized, whoa, I found another person that is as crazy about movies as I am. I've never experienced this with anyone else before. And then from there, we're really great friends, and a lot of our, not like all of it, but a lot of our time in our friendship is spent talking about movies. So we were like, hey, let's just do this in more of a quote unquote formal space. Even though this is not formal at all, but, we're having fun, and we're so glad everyone's here with us. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you sort of said this already, but one of the things I love most about our friendship as it relates to movies is the fact that we are so different in our tastes, and that we've been able to share with each other a lot of different things where we can have really great conversations, even if one of us watches a movie and it's like, this is the most moving thing I've ever seen in my life, and it has impacted me deeply. And the other person says, yeah, it was fine. But I always love hearing what Tatum has to say about a movie, even if it isn't something that, I really thought about when I was watching it. Hearing what moved her about it causes me to look at that movie differently, and to look just more deeply at the world and how different people are and how differently people receive things, and come to appreciate, the differences in taste and the differences in reception, and how, different things can really help people and cause them to grow and cause them to look at the world differently. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So
I agree. Yeah, that's why we have this podcast, because we love, I guess, uniting with other people's perspectives and hearing, I don't know, just like sharing in their experience, even if we might not have had the same relationship with it. And just to kind of expound on something I didn't, I guess, say before, but yeah, so Geneva kind of highlighted her taste that she tends towards most of the time, which is a lot of classic films. What would you say, Geneva, like pre-1970s?
Yeah.
Or 1960s?
I mean, the 1940s are kind of my ideal decade for film.
Yeah, like she loves old movies and musicals, Gene Kelly, she's, Jimmy Stewart, all that stuff. And then I'm kind of post 1980s. I'm very much so into, I'm into old stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
to be clear, we both love
things across
all
the board.
movies and have watched all movies from all times.
All movies of all times. But I tend to gravitate towards a lot more of the more modern indie films, foreign films, because I think growing up mixed, my dad kind of exposed me to African American cinema and things like that. So I think just from a ground level growing up, I was already like, okay, all these different types of things, not to like diminish Geneva's taste or experience or whatever. And I'm also bilingual. I also speak Spanish. So I'm kind of like foreign language, different countries, and post 1980s type of thing. So as this podcast goes on, as Geneva and I both choose movies to talk about each week, you'll find a lot of Geneva's choices being more classic films and then mine being more, for lack of a better word, modern. But like we said, we both kind of watch everything.
Yeah.
So,
and I also, just to add to establish expectations up front, I feel like I also watch a bit more widely than you, in the sense that I watch a lot more movies that are not good or are more like mainstream. I love rom-coms. I love a good action movie, a good superhero movie, which like you like specific instances of them too, but they're not your go-tos. They're not as common, I think, in your watching rotation as they are in mine.
Yeah, maybe Geneva can attest to this. I've gotten a lot more open-minded over time, but I'm definitely, I'm more of a snob than Geneva is. And I say that with the highest of praise. I wish I wasn't as much of a snob as I am. But yeah, I mean, but I'm not rude about it. At least I don't think I mean, this is, but yeah, I definitely am a lot less, I'm a lot less tolerant of movies that are not like, I'm just going to stop there. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. You guys will learn as we move forward.
Yeah.
You'll learn our personalities.
It's all good.
Yes.
We all have different tastes and we all have different things to learn. And, that's why we do this. And that's why we love movies and we love talking about them. All right. So today on the show, for our very first episode, we're going to start off by discussing Inception. Yes. I was waiting for it. All right. Inception is a 2010 sci-fi action film directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Marion Cotillard, Ken Watanabe, among others. I'm sure that most of you who are listening to this will have watched Inception at some point in your lives. It was a massive hit when it first came out. One of the reasons that we picked this movie to start with is because this is a movie that we both really, really love and have a lot of appreciation for. So, Tatum, why don't you start us off by talking about when did you first see Inception and what is your general relationship with it?
Yeah, so I saw this movie when it first came out in 2010. And let's just say that in my mind, there are few films that I have very specific recollections of what the movie going experience was like. I can still remember it. I can still feel it. Inception is one of those movies. I think I saw it 3 times in theaters, and then I saw it again when it was re-released 2 years ago in theaters. So needless to say, I love this movie. I remember when I first saw it in theaters, I had never experienced suspense in such a huge way like I did in Inception. Just like I thought that the movie was suspenseful, but then once the van fell off the bridge and then they keep like the editing of it, the way that they cut back and forth at certain moments to remind you that the van is falling. The way that this movie plays with time, because the movie is about time, right? Even the structure of the movie itself reflects time, how it's edited, and it has the ability to make such a short sequence of time as small as 5 seconds and make it 30 minutes. And I really admire the editing and how it just plays with that idea. And so, yeah, the movie's great. I think watching it again this time, I really was impacted by the acting. I think in the past, I've been so caught up in the spectacle and just how freaking cool the movie is. But this time watching it again and actually having a notebook next to me and writing things down, I was like, wow, the acting performances in this movie are really great. And shout out to the casting director. I should probably look up who he or she is, but they did a really great job. So yeah, I'm going to try not to ramble because we've got plenty more time to talk about this. But yes, needless to say, I love this movie. The first time I saw it, I fell in love with it. I was on the edge of my freaking seat the entire time. I was like, I have never seen anything like this before. This is so incredible. And I don't know if I've ever seen anything that mentally intrigues me in the same way that this movie does since this movie. Maybe that's not true, but anyway. Yeah, I love this movie. I'm really glad that Geneva picked it for number 1, or at least our first episode. It was on my list to talk about at some point, but Geneva was like, hey, let's start with this one. And I was like, Sweet. Sounds amazing to me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you said, I would heartily agree with, because that was my experience with it. Inception is actually, it came out the year that I first went away to college. And so I actually have a very strong association with seeing it in the movie theater in my college town with a whole bunch of, new people that I had just I had just met, and it absolutely just blowing my mind. And going away to college was kind of a thing that was pretty pivotal in my sort of relationship with movies, in the sense that it was now, being away from family, now I had more freedom to choose the things that I wanted to watch, and to really make active choices to seek out things. And so 2010 was kind of the year that I was starting to really get into film and get into following awards and get into, let me look up things, fill in gaps in my knowledge, finally go and watch things that I hadn't had a chance to watch before. And Inception, yeah, just absolutely blew my mind in what it could do, the way it achieved all of its ends. It was a movie that I saw it with a lot of friends, and we were just kind of talking about it for weeks afterward. I saw it multiple times. And then since then, I mean, I think I had only seen Batman Begins of Christopher Nolan's filmography prior to that, I hadn't yet seen The Dark Knight. But since then, I've become a big fan of Christopher Nolan. And so that it's also a movie that kind of sparked his place in my awareness and kind of made him stand out to me. And it is really funny just going through it, I guess 12 years now after it first premiered, having now seen the rest of his filmography. He is such a consistent director in the things that he is interested in, and the themes that keep emerging throughout his work, which I find really fascinating. Lots of dead wives, which is definitely something that we could talk about.
Lots of dead wives.
But his, like you were saying, Tatum, his relationship with time and the idea of time compression and time dilation is so fascinating. One thing I think that is really fascinating about his filmography in general, but I think Inception is kind of a really good encapsulation of this. Like it just has so many of the sort of themes and strengths and weaknesses in his work are all kind of tied up in Inception. It's one of those movies that you can just look at and be like, this is kind of the director and his interests summed up in one. But is that the idea of dreaming and the way that dreaming is represented, I find is so fascinating. I was looking up other critical perspectives from the time, and then kind of more recent retrospective look backs. And a lot of people comment on the fact that this movie is entirely about dreaming, and yet it's a very sort of sterile in the way that it looks and is presented. And there's a lot of surreal imagery in the sense of, cities folding in on themselves, and, stairs that lead to nowhere, and those kind of really cool, inventive things. But there's not a whole lot of, it's a very intellectually charged movie, which is not to say, I think we can talk about kind of the philosophical ideas that are at work behind it, and the degree to which, they have a whole lot of depth or nuance. But it is a movie that really, and I think Christopher Nolan as a director, you really approach him in a sort of a sense of intellectual engagement, which is something that I really connect with about him. And there is emotion that comes through. I actually find this to be a deeply emotional movie, but it is very much emotion that's accessed through appreciation for the sort of the filmmaking, appreciation for the use of these kind of heady concepts of timelines and actions on one level being reflected on another level. And, consciousness versus subconsciousness, these sort of, things that are more, you approach them, with thought, you engage them with thought rather than just sort of approaching them first through the heart or through the instinct. And I find that really fascinating about him. And I think it's, for my personality, it really works. It really allows me to connect with them, although I understand that for some people it might make it a bit more difficult to connect with.
I think a lot of people say that Christopher Nolan's movies are he doesn't know how to experience emotion. He just talks about it. And I can see that perspective, but I also disagree. I think that he approaches emotion, but just in a very intellectual sort of way. Like you said, Geneva, for example, the movie Interstellar, This is not a review of Interstellar, so I'll just like
for another day
quickly reference it. But there are some sequences in that movie that are highly, highly emotional, but at least for me. But because it's caught up in this scientific, philosophical type of thing, it's just a different approach. And actually, this time watching Inception, I actually had a completely different takeaway from this movie than I have in the past. Because I think in the past, I have kind of thought, oh, yeah, it's about dreams and the complexity and the philosophy of Billie Eilish, like when we fall asleep, where do we go? But actually, this time around watching it, I was fascinated. I was like, this is actually ultimately a movie about trauma. I was going to say Leonardo DiCaprio's character. Dom Cobb, stupid name, by the way. Dom Cobb, he is someone who not only has his wife died, but also you could make the argument that he killed her because he's the one who planted the idea in his wife's mind. And I think in reality, if that were possible, the person who has lived through that and did that to their spouse, they would probably be extremely traumatized by that. And no matter how much they might look okay on the outside, their subconscious is probably reeling with the reality of what they did, what their spouse did, what they've been through. And because this whole movie is diving into his subconscious or him bringing his subconscious into someone else's, I ultimately, this time watching it, was like, this is a really fascinating study on trauma, how it affects our brains, and what the effect of that would be if we actually saw everybody's traumas and how it's impacting them without them being able to hide it. Because the subconscious, right, you can't control it. They say that's literally a quote in the movie, like, it's my subconscious, I can't control it. So I found that to be really fascinating. And I think that that's ultimately a very emotional type of subject matter. I killed my wife. And how is that affecting me and how I approach the world and how I live my life? So I don't know. It hit me different this time. It did feel like more of an emotional experience for me than it had been in the past.
So fascinating.
So,
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one thing that I've always found very interesting about this movie is I care very deeply about whether or not Cobb and the gang pull off the heist. And I'm always, I'm on the edge of my seat as the van is falling into the water and they're trying to figure out how they can restart the kicks and get everyone back to the surface in time. But I don't find myself not caring as much, but the idea of him getting back to his children is kind of more remote to me, if that makes sense. Like I feel like I engage with it as sort of a plot device much more than I engage with the emotional aspect. But where the emotions really hit for me is more the Fisher storyline, which the more I watch the movie, the more I love seeing those two as kind of a parallel to each other. I actually think Fisher has a really interesting arc in the movie that runs parallel to Cobb, and I find it very moving tracking his relationship to his father, who has been this kind of emotionally negligent force in his life, where he loves his father and yet he feels like he can never live up to him. He's kind of resigned himself to always feeling like he has not done enough, always feeling like his father is never going to love him. And what the team is doing is suggesting this idea that you can, which actually watching it now, having now finally seen Memento only a few months ago for the first time, they both are very thematically similar in this idea of you having the power to kind of craft your own reality and base the purpose of your life on this, crafting meaning out of that is not necessarily tied to reality. And I don't say that as a positive way. I think one of the fascinating things about Inception is Cobb gets to the end and he sets the top spinning and he goes to see his children and he turns away. He doesn't care yet anymore whether the top continues spinning or whether it stops. He's achieved his ends and he doesn't ultimately care whether or not he's in a dream. But that does raise the question of, is that a good thing? And there's that question with Fisher of, he has finally achieved this emotional catharsis. He has finally come to a place where he can rewrite his relationship with his father so that his father did ultimately love him. And this choice that he's making, the choice that he's been manipulated by the team to make, is to move forward with this positive understanding and to be his own man and to believe that his father did indeed love him. But we don't know that he did. You know, the information that we have at our disposal is not really positive toward that. And so it does leave this really fascinating question of, is it better to just kind of create your own sense of reality and start to live out of that? Or is it better to be insisting for reality as it is? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Why don't we start going through the plot a little bit? And I was trying to write up a summary of the plot, and it's just immensely complicated because one of the things that is so amazing about this movie, as you pointed out, Tatum, is the way it's edited and the writing as well. Just the two of those things working in tandem. Like, as I was rewatching it, I was so struck and impressed by how amazingly it is written and then edited to create these incredible sequences where 5 different things are happening all at the same time. And it's very difficult to, you get all the sense of what's happening, and yet it's very difficult to actually write down a linear plot summary. But I have done my best. So, all right. So the movie starts with some amazing Hans Zimmer bombs.
Geneva,
Yes.
the very first thing that I wrote down was blah, blah, before the movie even starts. Literally,
Yep.
before you
Setting the tone early.
Before you see anything, it's just already Hans Zimmer coming in and being like, all right, ultimately, I know Christopher Nolan is the director, but I own this film.
Yes, he absolutely does. And this score was just it. I feel like it had an impact on action movies for the next, especially trailer music for the next 10 plus years. I mentioned before that this movie was around the time I started getting really into the Oscars. The very first Oscars that I remember ever watching with a very specific, like, I want this thing to win, was watching the 2011 Oscars, feeling like there would be no justice in the world if the Inception score did not win, which it did not. And I've had the same sort of antagonistic and yet needy relationship to the Oscars ever since.
Hey, at least you knew what you were getting into right off the bat.
My expectations were set low and have consistently been lowered.
What won that year?
It was The Social Network.
How did this not win?
The Social Network actually does have a really excellent score. It's not like it was a undeserving win.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's just especially with the knowledge, the hindsight of how influential the Inception score would be, you know, it's hard to believe that it didn't win.
Yeah, I'm shocked by that.
Yep. Anyway, okay, so yes, we start with the score. Leonardo DiCaprio as Dom Cobb washes up on a beach. He's taken to this really beautiful sort of Japanese style home. Everything is kind of dark wood and gold. Everyone's very elegant, which is sort of a theme throughout the movie, the visuals. He meets Saito, who is played by Ken Watanabe, but who is aged. He looks like he's about 100 or so. And
can I just say that some characters in this movie call him Saito and some call him Sato, and that really bothers me. Why? Like, was Christopher Nolan on set? Was Christopher Nolan specifically on set like, I want you to say it this way and I want you to say it this way? Or did he not notice? Did he not care?
They forgot to have an all-cast meeting at the beginning of production to settle it. Although, to be honest, I feel like that's kind of consistent with reality, that if there's a name that is ever so slightly unfamiliar to an English speaker, you'll find every variation of pronunciation on the planet.
Yeah. At least they didn't call him like Steve or something.
Steve.
Bad joke.
All right. So Saito sees this little metallic top that Cobb had in his pocket, and he starts saying these cryptic things about something I remember from a half remembered dream. And then we cut, and we're in the same location, but it seems to be sometime earlier. So Cobb and Arthur, who's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, they are attempting to pull off a robbery on Saito's house. So Saito now much younger, and they're attempting to steal some files, but Cobb is betrayed by this mysterious woman named Mal, who seems to know Cobb from the past. Cobb manages to get the files, but he opens up the folder and all the information is redacted. And so everything that he got is totally useless. At the same time, the sequence starts to be intercut with all of these shots of the characters in a different location. They're in this dingy apartment. There's this violent mob going on outside the window. And we start to realize that Cobb, Arthur, and Saito are all in this apartment and they're all dreaming. And the heist is the dream. And what Cobb and Arthur are trying to do is to steal information from Saito's mind. So Saito wakes up in the apartment. He tells Cobb and Arthur they've failed. But then we see the scene intercut with shots of the characters in yet another location, which is a high-speed train. Saito realizes that Cobb actually layered a dream within a dream, and he's really impressed at this. Then in the real world, Cobb and Arthur, they wake up on the train, they end the dream, and they escape. So in this, I paused on my recent rewatch of this at this point. This is about 15 minutes into the movie. The movie's about 2.5 hours long. It's quite long, although it doesn't feel that long. And so 15 minutes in, again, with how amazingly this movie is written and structured, we have basically laid out the entirety of everything that you need to know about the existence of shared dreaming, the concept of extraction, the way that the existence of totems, the way that dreams can be layered within one another, the idea of kicks, like all of this crucial information that we're going to need to know to understand the rest of the movie has been laid out. It's all going to be explained in more detail later. But once it's explained, we're going to know what they're talking about because we've all seen it in action. And I just think that's such great screenwriting. Like, I think you can have quibbles with aspects of the writing in this movie, specific characterizations, lines of dialogue, things like that. But the way that this movie is structured, I think it takes a lot of talent to lay things out as cleanly. And for something that is as exposition heavy as this movie is like 75% exposition, they do such a good job of laying everything out very naturally, where you're just imbibing all of this information and you're discovering it, and it feels very fun. It doesn't feel like you're sitting down for a lesson. You're in it, but you're also learning at the same time.
So, Geneva, I literally agree with everything that you just said. Yeah, I find that a lot of people, they complain about Christopher Nolan and how his writing is very expositional. And I do see that in a lot of his movies, including this one. But I think in Inception, it's one of his best instances of doing that. Because yes, it's very expositional, but it's done in a way that to me feels very natural. And I don't feel like I'm sitting in a lecture hall listening to someone be like, okay, here's the concept of time and how it works. From the very beginning, I'm not going to repeat everything Geneva said, but it establishes everything, but in such a nail-biting, entertaining way. And it makes you want more of like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Who's this character? What are they doing? Why were they old and now they're young? So many things are introduced right off the bat. And I think that, like Geneva said, it's really a sign of excellent screenwriting, in my opinion, because screenwriting is quite difficult. And writing something that from the very beginning gets your attention and makes you want to keep reading or watching, but at the same time explains what you need to know, is so immensely hard to do. Like, you watch it and it seems simple, but when you sit down to try and write something, it's not easy. So yeah, I made a note on that as well. I really, really admire it. And then I also had to comment on Marion Cotillard's dress in the opening sequence. Marion Cotillard is stunning in anything that she does or wears. And also, she is not defined by her beauty. She is her own person, all of those things. But also, she looks fabulous in this form-fitting, sparkly, yet dark, sleek. It's incredible, and I love it. And it stood out to me so much that I was like, I have to comment on this. I feel like it was a dress that was custom made for her.
It has to be. She looks like she's poured into it. And actually, I'm so glad she said that, because that brings up a point that I literally wrote down in my notes, which is everyone in this movie is so freaking hot. And it's kind of insane.
Yeah.
Like, when I first watched this movie,
it's not fair.
Sparks, 18. I was just entering college, sparked a massive crush on Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And then rewatching it 10 years later, I'm just like, wow, there's just everyone in this movie. So hot.
Yeah, all the suits and formal wear. You never see people dressed like that anymore, so it's refreshing.
Well, and again, I really appreciate.
We all know Christopher Nolan loves a good suit.
Again, I really appreciate the fact that for Christopher Nolan, like, exploring your dreams means everyone is in an immaculately tailored business suit, just like walking around in hallways,
Even if they're in Mombasa, they're still like
gorgeously pressed.
Like not even trying to blend into the culture at all.
Yeah.
No. And then also, I know I kind of referenced this before, but I need to just get it out because I think this is something that I have thought about even ever since the first time I saw this movie. What the F is up with these names? I cannot. Dom Cobb is so weird, and then Maul. Dom Cobb is terrible. Maul is weird. I don't understand why you have someone like Arthur, and then, you have all these normal names, and then let's throw in like Ariadne, and I'm like, why? Maybe they're French names that I'm just not familiar with, but also Ariadne has an American accent, as does Dom Cobb, so why would they? So I just don't. And so does, why am I forgetting his name right now? Michael Caine, who's the father.
Miles, I think his name is.
They're not, they talk like they're, wait, hold on a second. Wait a minute. Michael Caine is British. And then his son, Dom Cobb, is not?
Okay.
Wait.
We don't have time to get into the complicated family dynamics, but I have always wondered this, because I actually always assumed Michael Caine was Marion Cotillard's father. But if that's the case, why is he British? Why was she French? And why are Dom's kids living in the United States when Miles apparently sees them regularly? It's very confusing.
I said this before earlier. I'm sure we'll get into it a little later, but this movie, as much as I love it, and I do love it, I absolutely love this movie. It's, just to throw this out there, it is my favorite Nolan film. Judge me all you want. It's my favorite Nolan film.
Good choice.
Not by much though, because there are definitely close seconds and thirds. But if you look too closely at this, in my notes, I wrote down like 4 very extreme plot holes that basically make this entire movie fall apart if you think about that. So it's like, don't look too closely at this, but also if you do, it doesn't matter because the movie is just so damn good. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, every time I watch it, I'm impressed anew about how this movie is just so, the balance is just so perfect. And it's so like I feel like House of Cards is often used as a pejorative, but it's so precisely engineered in the sense that you tip over one thing and the whole thing falls apart, but you don't. The thing isn't falling apart. It works, it somehow works despite the fact that it shouldn't. And I feel like too, there's a little bit of a, not a cop-out, but like a pass that you can give it, which I'd like to talk about more later. We don't need to get into this now. But with the ending, there is that idea of, there are a lot of things about this movie that don't really make sense. But does that matter? Because it's possible the whole thing is just Dom Cobb's dream. So, if for, at the very least, you can always kind of, explain things away that way. Okay, so we discovered that Cobb is a wanted man in the United States. We don't yet know why, but he's unable to go home and see his children, which he really wants to do. Saito finds him and Arthur, and he makes them a deal. He says he can get the charges against Cobb to go away if Cobb can implant an idea into the mind of Robert Fisher, played by Cillian Murphy, who's the son of Saito's main business competitor. So what Saito wants is for Fisher to break up his company after his father, Maurice Fisher, has died. This is called Inception, the idea of implanting an idea as opposed to extracting information from someone's mind. So Arthur thinks that Inception's impossible, but Cobb says that it can be done because he's actually done it before. Anything on that?
Nope.
Okay. Cut that out. Cut out the ass. Okay, great. All right, so Cobb and Arthur begin to prepare for the mission. So to design the world of the dream, Cobb recruits an architecture student named Ariadne, played by Elliot Page, and he teaches her the rules of shared dreaming. The team also includes Saito, Eames, who's played by Tom Hardy, who's a forger who can impersonate specific characters, and Yusef, played by Dilip Rao, who is a chemist who designs a sedative that allows them to enter into multiple dream layers. Together, the team studies the complicated relationship between Fisher and his father, and they decide to use a 3-level dream that will give Fisher the idea that breaking up his father's company is a positive move that shows that he's ready to become his own person. Fisher's father dies. The team plans for the mission to take place on a long-haul flight from Sydney to Los Angeles. Sprinkled all throughout this plot, we learn more about Cobb's relationship with Mal and why he can't return to the United States. So the two of them were experimenting with dream sharing, and they accidentally spent 50 years in limbo, where Mal eventually lost track of reality. Cobb performed Inception in order to destabilize her sense of reality and convince her to wake up. However, he didn't realize that after waking up, Mal would continue to think that she was still dreaming, and so she ends up committing suicide, thinking that that was going to wake her up. And she tries to force Cobb to join her by framing him for her murder. So Cobb had to flee the United States, and he's been trying to get back to his kids ever since.
I think we should also note that the reason that Cobb takes on this job is because this is his only way to get back to his kids. Saito offered, if you can plant this idea in Fisher's mind and it works, then I can make one phone call from the plane and you will have no problem getting through immigration.
Yes, easy as pie, which, would it actually work that way? Does it matter if it would not work that way?
Hey, you know how those high power phone calls to the right person work?
Yeah.
So can I just jump in and say a few things here? So I wrote down that the whole warehouse that the entire prepping for the mission happens in, I was looking at that warehouse and I was like, that warehouse is a set dressing nightmare. I have had to dress, I actually just recently did on a movie a few weeks ago. We had to go into a warehouse that looked just like this because they were planning a mission. And in my mind, I'm like, why does every movie where they're planning a mission happen in a dang warehouse? Whatever.
Much more comfortable spaces to rent.
Yeah, but we were literally dressing a very similar set. It had a whiteboard and they were writing plans, sitting in chairs, blah, 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 planning a heist. And so, but watching this, I was like, I have prepped these warehouses before. This is a nightmare because I guarantee you this is a really, really old warehouse that's been untouched for decades. And the set deck crew has to go in, sweep up decades worth of old metal pieces and shavings and wood, blah, 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 sweep all that stuff up while they're choking on it. And then bring in all of these big shelves and old heavy things. And then there were all of these newspapers plastered up against the windows. And I was like, this set looks really cool, but also this would have been the worst, not the worst, but it would not have been a fun set to prep as a set dresser. So that was just a thought that I had while watching that.
Fascinating. I love hearing Tatum's set dressing corner. I hope this becomes a regular installment.
And then also, I have a very strong feeling about this. What happened to Tom Hardy? I feel like Tom Hardy had this whole, 5-year period maybe, where he was in TV shows, movies. He had all of this acclaim, really talented, nominated for Oscars, blah, 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 Emmys, all these different things. I don't know if he was nominated for Emmys, but he was in a show that was. Anyway, and now it's so you're just doing freaking Venom movies? What happens? Because I think, like I said in the beginning, all of the acting in this movie I'm actually quite impressed with. But I honestly think that I'm most impressed with Tom Hardy's performance. I totally believe him as this character of Eames. I love his swag, his style, his attitude. He's also the best at what he does as a forger. I love his humor.
It's a star-making performance.
Yes.
I'm sure there are people who were more into movies at the time who knew who he was already, but that movie is the first time that I had certainly ever heard of Tom Hardy, and I think that was kind of his introduction for a lot of people. And watching it again, years later, the dynamic between him and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, that's sort of aggressive and yet flirty. It's so good. Their chemistry is so good. I can just imagine the hundreds and hundreds of fan fictions that dynamic probably spawned, which I'm sure exist on the internet.
Unlike the ridiculously forced quote unquote chemistry or lack thereof between Joseph Gordon-Levitt and at the time Ellen Page, now Elliot Page, don't force this if it's not working. Get rid of that and just dive into the chemistry that exists between these two characters where it's just naturally flowing, which is not me to say, like, it is very possible for men to be friends and have this type of relationship and like have it not be romantic at all. But putting this relationship up against the one in this movie that is supposed to be romantic, it just, I don't know. It's so odd to me.
If the romance, to the extent that it is there, is so, I mean, I kind of appreciate that it is so dialed back and bare bones that you can basically just ignore it and won't change anything. So it doesn't bother me too much, but yeah, chemistry is not there. I was just going to comment on how much I love the sequence of, I mean, this entire section, it is so hard to talk about because it is just an hour or more of exposition mixed with preparation. There's just all of these little individual moments. It's kind of hard to talk about it linearly. But I love so much the way that Ariadne forms this. I think there are issues with Ariadne as a character. I mean, there isn't really a whole lot of character there, but as a sort of audience surrogate introducing us to this world, her interactions with Cobb and with the rest of the team work really well. And I love in particular so much the sequence with her and Cobb when she's first entering the dream world, when Paris starts exploding around them and the city starts folding in on itself. And it's something that I think we've kind of seen now in several movies since then, but just thinking about how cool and unique and new that was at the time. And it's such an amazing image that is, it's just universal. You understand it, you're awed by it, seeing it in a theater when it's huge, it's so visually inventive. It's so playful. One of the things that's underrated about this movie is and I think about Christopher Nolan's filmography in general is, he's generally regarded as someone who takes himself very seriously, which he definitely does. A lot of seriousness in his movies. But there's also a lot of fun. This movie is just fun. It's long, but it just flies by because you're just enjoying the heck out of the ride. You're enjoying all the interactions with the characters. You're enjoying learning all of these things. You get this chance.
There's literally a scene with someone fighting in a hallway while they're floating and they're spinning around. If that's not fun, then I don't know what is.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just, this idea, and they talk about this, Ariadne at first is this seems dangerous. Cobb is clearly unstable. I'm not crazy about this. And she quits. But Cobb is she'll be back. And she is. And it's because they say it's that idea of pure creation. Cobb says reality is not going to be enough for her. And
can I just say real quick, that was one thing that annoyed me in the screenwriting, the fact that she comes back and Arthur's there's just nothing like it. And then her response is, it's just your creation. And I'm that is the laziest sentence ever. And Elliot tried to deliver that in a realistic way, but it just falls so flat because it's just not a good line.
It's not a great line, but it's actually funny that you say that because I had marked that out in my notes where I'm I think this, even if the line itself is not great, I think the concept is really fascinating in that sort of, this idea of what do we love about the idea of dreams? It's that idea of endless possibility. That's what's so attractive and so seductive about it to Cobb, to Moll prior to her death. It leads these people into these alternate realities where they can create the world around them to be whatever it can be. And people get sucked into it, people choose to voluntarily give up actual reality in order to stay within this realm. And I think that's just a fascinating concept. And the movie doesn't really interrogate too much the dark side of it, but it's definitely there. So yeah, I was very struck by that line, even if it's not necessarily like great dialogue.
Yeah. I think the concept is great. I just think the line itself is not the best written.
Yeah.
So, okay, I have a few more thoughts about this section before we dive into part 2. So for the heist prep, still kind of in that zone of things, I have a couple thoughts. First one is and this confused me when I first watched it, and it still confuses me now. I don't understand why Mal is written to be such a scary character. As Ariadne is starting to go into Cobb's dreams and learn more about who he is, who she is, there's literally a sequence where she walks into the hotel room and Mal is sitting there and she turns her head and there's like a bomb, like a horror sound.
Horror movie villain.
Yeah, and then Mal runs up to the elevator, is shaking it and looks up. She's possessed. And I just find it to be so odd because the movie, I feel like the catharsis of the movie for Cobb's character would be so much better if we felt more of the love that had existed between him and Mal before she passed away. But instead of that, a lot of the times that we see her, she's portrayed as this, and I understand that, okay, it's his projection of her, and because of the subconscious, she's got a different character from the reality of who she was. I get that. But why do we have to take this extra step and kind of make her like a horror villain? Mm-hmm. That's just an odd choice to me. And it's always been kind of weird and it feels out of place and over the top in my mind. But yeah, that's just a thought that I had. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but it's always struck me as kind of odd.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Definitely. I mean, there's a frequent criticism in, not to bring this back to Christopher Nolan's entire filmography, but like there is a frequent criticism with him that female characters are not very well written. And I have sort of mixed feelings about that. Like I agree in certain instances. In other instances, I think, well, it's more that he's just not really, his stories are not really concerned with gender dynamics. And so the characters are their gender just doesn't matter. And he just happens to not cast women in roles unless their gender is somehow essential to that character, which is a problem in and of itself. But I do think that there are issues with Mal as a character. And I think part of it is the fact that we never actually meet the real Mal, and I think this is why that storyline, Cobb's catharsis when it comes to Mal, that never fully works for me, even though the actual mission itself really works, is his big revelation is, oh, this person is not my wife. My wife was better than this. She was more complex than this. She was much more of an interesting, complex human being. And this person is just this flattened projection that I have of her. And I can't really say how the movie could have done this differently, because I think it works in the sense that it's supposed to fulfill, but there is something a bit lacking, because it's like, yeah, of course, this person we've been seeing them as this flat projection the entire time. We're not seeing Cobb, when he's going into his own dream state, which we see him do throughout the film. The idea is like he sneaks off to go and spend time with Mal. We're not seeing their interactions at those times. We're only seeing their interactions as they're relating to Ariadne or some other character who's threatening that dynamic. And so we only ever see Mal in the context of her kind of protecting her territory with Cobb. So we don't get a sense of anything that's more rounded or dimensional to their relationship. We have that one line from Arthur where Ariadne asks her what the real Mal was like, and he's like, she was lovely, which I think is like a nice, beautiful, simple statement, but we don't see
Christopher Nolan's like, that's all you need to know about her.
Yeah.
She was yeah. No, I want more.
Yeah, yeah. Like I love the way he delivers that. I like the kind of simplicity to it. I can't sum up this person. All you need to know is that she was lovely. But as an audience member, only seeing this woman in the context of her acting like a horror villain, then you're like, Yeah, it's very flattening to a character that could have had a lot more depth.
Yeah. So I've got two more thoughts from this, I guess, phase of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty brief. So one of them I think is just funny. So maybe you won't find it funny, but I'll just say it real quick. I wrote down the quote from this sequence where, like, because Ariadne, as much as the character is interesting, gotta admit, she's kind of nosy, right? Let this man process his own trauma and grief in his own time. It's not.
Well, but also like that, but also, and this is not my thought. This is another podcast episode I listened to on this movie pointing this out. Why does she not just go, if she's really concerned, which she should be, about Cobb's inability to process his trauma, wrecking the team and putting the heist and putting them all in danger? Why didn't she go to Arthur or go to Eames or go to any other person on the team and like express her concerns? Like, she's very concerned about keeping his problem is quiet when it's like, yeah, but other people are affected.
But if it's like an actual risk.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry,
I agree with you. So I wrote down the quote from the movie where she sneaks into his dreams and they're going through the elevators and all that stuff. And he's like, this has nothing to do with you. And she's like, it has everything to do with me. You asked me to share dreams with you. And he says, not those. And then he proceeds to show her several of the dreams. It's like, you asked me to share dreams with you, not these. Let me show you 3 more. It's like, wait. Like, why? That doesn't make sense. And then he's walking her through all these really intimate moments that are very private. And he's like, here, let me just show you a few more, even though I said stop. Anyway, I thought that was funny. And then the other thing I wanted to note, so this is kind of, I've got a couple plot holes with this movie that I want to mention as they come up. This is the first one that kind of came up. It's not technically a plot hole, but it's like an inconsistency, I guess, in the writing. And I do think it's kind of a plot hole-ish. But Dom goes through this whole thing of expressing to Ariadne, that, or maybe it's Arthur who kind of explains it to her. No one else can touch your totem, because if they know how your totem works, then it defeats the purpose, because now someone else can basically manipulate that to then manipulate your own understanding of reality, whatever, like all of that stuff, which I think is a really interesting concept. But then Dom ends up telling Ariadne how his totem works, because he's explaining to her, oh yeah, this was Mal's totem, and it was a truth that she had chosen to forget. And in a dream, she would drop the top and it would spin and spin and spin. He literally tells Ariadne how the totem works, which I guess there's that whole sequence in the movie where Arthur does say, oh, I guess you figured out how much time Cobb spends doing things he says not to do. But I feel like the concept of the totem is so important, especially for someone like Cobb, who has a very thin grasp on what reality is at this point. And the fact that he just tells Ariadne how the totem works, I'm pretty sure that's not an okay thing to do. And I don't feel like Cobb as a character would do that. But anyway, it's just a complaint that I have.
No, it's a good complaint. Actually, I sort of agree and disagree, because I think it probably is not a good thing to do, but I think it absolutely is something Cobb would do, because just the fact that he's using Mal's totem as opposed to getting a totem of his own is an indication that his grasp on reality has already been weakened, and that he is
that's interesting.
Why is he using Mal's totem? Why doesn't he have a totem of his own? I think there's a sense in which reality has already been blurred for him, and he is kind of refusing to own up to the extent to which he is allowing reality and dreams to become blurred.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm here for it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the heist begins. They go onto the airplane, the long haul flight. They manage to drug Fisher and start the heist, which, by the way, it always kind of cracks me up. But the when Cobb tricks Fisher into drinking the drugged water, Cillian Murphy takes like the teensiest little sip of that water, and then he is out. And I'm like, how strong was the drug in that water? If he had drunk the entire glass, would he have died?
Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Anyway.
Also, Another funny thing that I always love in this movie is when they're talking about like, oh man, the flight, you'd have to buy out the whole cabin and the blah, blah, blah. And Saito's just like, I bought the airline. I was just like, okay.
Okay. So great.
This movie does have some humor in it. It does have some humor in it. I like it.
I mean, I always love, I mean, it's such a small moment, but I always love when Yusuf has done like a particularly good bit of driving to avoid the projections, and he turns around like, see what I just did? And everyone's drugged. Everyone's out. He's like, oh, right. It's also, just such a small moment, but.
I was gonna bring this up later, but I feel like it'll just come up now. It's super brief comment, but I feel like Yusuf by far has the worst job out of everyone in really this whole heist.
Like, he doesn't get to do anything fun.
Pulled the short straw. Everything depends on him. He's the one being shot at by a million different. It's just. And it's like in other layers they're getting shot at, right? But at least they have other people around to help. Yusuf's like, nope, it's just me by myself against a whole army. Saito's dying in the back seat. You know, like the whole mission, me getting to the kick at the right time, making sure they have enough time. Yusuf's gonna need some therapy after this.
I know. Which, by the way, you talk about like what happened to, you know, where has Tom Hardy been the last few years? Dilip Rao was in he was in Avatar, and then he was in Inception, and I'm sure he's been working, but like, where has he been? He's so great in this movie.
Who was he in Avatar? I don't remember.
Yeah, he's one of the scientists in Avatar.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. But anyway, justice for Dilip Rao, because he's great. I'm sure he's been in lots of stuff that I just haven't seen, but I feel like we need to appreciate him more. Okay, so they're in the dream. So in the first dream level, which is a city street, the team kidnaps Fisher. Eames impersonates his grandfather, Peter Browning, and he introduces the idea of an alternate will that Fisher's father left that would break up the company. And Fisher's like, what? Why on earth would my father want to do that? The team, while they're trying to do this sort of fake kidnapping, they're attacked by Fisher's projections, because it turns out that Fisher's mind has been militarized. He's gone through the training, which they didn't expect. Saito is wounded, and so that puts a time crunch on the operation, because Cobb reveals that, which he didn't tell them ahead of time, which is a problem, because of the sedative, if they die, they're not going to wake up the way they normally would in a dream, but instead they're going to be sent to limbo, which is unconstructed dream space, which is very vague.
Nothing is down there except anything left behind by someone who's been there before, which in our case is just you.
I feel like limbo is the one part of this movie that is the least sort of explanation given, the least sort of thought out. It just sort of exists, and you're like, all right, you just got to accept it. But you know what?
I've got lots of plot holes for limbo. We'll get to it later.
Oh, boy. All right. So the team gets into a van and to go into the next dream layer. And so while the rest of the heist is happening, Yusuf is continually driving them around and trying to avoid getting caught by the projections before the kick. On the second level, they're in a hotel. Cobb plays a risky gambit by telling Fisher that they're dreaming and suggesting that he was kidnapped by Browning on the level above as a way to prevent Fisher from dissolving the company. So Fisher believes him, gets in on this. Cobb convinces Fisher to go into a deeper dream layer in order to figure out what Browning is up to. And while they're in the hotel room, Arthur is then protecting them from the projections. And eventually, when Yusuf is forced to start the kick early, the entire hotel, there's no gravity, everyone's floating. And so Arthur has to kind of improvise this special elevator explosive maneuver to give them a new kick. Then in the third layer, the team and Fisher infiltrate a snowy fortress. Fisher is shot by Mal before the inception can actually take place. Saito also dies of his wounds on the first level. To rescue them, Cobb and Ariadne have to go to Limbo, where they confront Mal. Cobb finally admits that his projection of Mal is inadequate, and he gives her up. He says, I'm not... Well, we'll talk about that. Ariadne shoots Mal and wakes up Fisher. Back on the third level, Fisher finally encounters the projection of his father, and he gets the emotional closure that he needed for their relationship. He discovers the idea is incepted in him that his father loves him and wants him to be his own man. Eames set off some explosions, which initiates the final kick and brings all the characters, apart from Cobb and Saito, back to the surface. In Limbo, we've gone back to the opening scene. So Cobb washes up on a strange beach, and he finds an aged Saito who's long since forgotten that he's living in a dream. Cobb reminds him of the need to return to reality. And then on the plane, everyone wakes up. The mission is over. Seemingly it has succeeded, and Saito makes a phone call. So we'll hold off on discussing that last scene. Why don't we talk about the heist altogether?
Should you start or shall I? I have lots of thoughts.
Why don't you start? Because I've got a few things, but I think you have more than me.
Okay, well, I will try and go through this relatively quickly because everything that Geneva just read is like a whole hour and a half sequence.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's thrilling. I love every second of it, but it's definitely a fair chunk of time with lots of things going on.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, speaking of which, one of the things I wrote down here, which Geneva also has mentioned, but this is one of the fastest 3-hour movies I've ever seen in my life. I've watched several movies where it's like, this is a good movie, but also I'm feeling how long it is. I love it and I'm enjoying it, but still, this feels so long. This movie does not feel long to me at all. So like, I wish that there was more of it.
Agreed. I was shocked. I had forgotten how long it was. I was shocked when I saw the runtime.
I know, it's crazy. Yes, so I just wanted to point out, before I did say that the acting performances are all great, I do think that there's one that is extraordinarily weak, and it really bothers me. I'm like, why did they cast this person? That's mean. I don't know. I just found the performance to be very weak. The man who plays Uncle Peter, who is it?
Tom Berenger.
Yeah, I find his performance to be incredibly weak. I think the character is great, the concept of the character, and I don't even think the writing for him is that bad. I just think his performance feels very stale, and he's just almost reading from a phone book. I don't know. His performance just bothers me because everyone else around him is so strong, and he's in a lot of scenes next to Cillian Murphy, who is going all out in this movie. So
Cillian Murphy and Pete Postlethwaite, by the way, are my pick for best performances in the movie, in a movie of, like you said, pretty much universally excellent performances.
Yeah, so good. Also, forgive me for saying Cillian Murphy instead of Killian, but mistake.
Our Irish listeners will appreciate
Isn't that like going back to what I said in the beginning? If it's not a normal American name, then two people pronounce it differently. Well, I just put my foot in my mouth. Here we go.
It's all good. It's all good. Safe space.
Speaking of Cillian Murphy, I did want to say that I found that his Robert Fisher character as being this pretty rich boy who's all of a sudden thrown into the scenario, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm eager to help out and be a tough guy and enter this mission. He's so eager to jump in, and he takes it so seriously. He's like, okay, yeah, let's do it. And everyone else is super educated and they know what's up. And then here's this guy who's just like, yeah, okay, sounds good. He's just so eager to help out. And I think it's really cute. I like that a lot. Okay, so I think this is another kind of complaint that I have. The sequence where they're on the third level and they're in the snow and everything, and then they realize, okay, we missed the first kick, we have to move faster. And then Cobb asks Ariadne, is there another way to cut through the maze to get to wherever? And she's like, I don't think I should tell you. And he's like, we don't have time for this, blah, blah, blah. She could have walked 5 feet away and talked quieter so that Cobb wouldn't hear.
No sense.
Which would mean that Maul wouldn't have showed up and shot Fisher, like all these. I'm like, it makes no sense that she's like, I'll stand right next to you and scream into the walkie. If she knows the stakes that are at place of, okay, clearly I have to share this information, but also Maul is a threat and blah, blah, blah. I feel like Ariadne is smart enough to be like, hey, take your headphones out. I'll walk over here and tell them. And then we can move forward.
That bothered me too. And it's worse than that because she's like, I don't think I should tell you. And he's like, we don't have time for this. Tell me. She does. And then he's like, great, tell them. And it's like, no. you should have just said, tell them.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It's entirely Cobb's fault.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I agree. Okay. And then I guess the rest of my comments are pretty quick. So yeah, I think the fact that like, just the concept that Robert Fisher has no idea of what's going on this whole time. Everyone else is like feeling this urgency of, if we don't accomplish this mission, then all of this stuff's going to happen and blah, blah, blah. And then Fisher's just like, yeah, they're trying to get a code to break into my father's safe and they're being mean to my godfather. It's like, okay, I just think that concept is really funny to me, that he's just in a totally different understanding of what's going on for this entire sequence of the movie.
I know, again, well, this is why I think that his storyline is so fascinating, because it's like, it's not a large chunk of the movie. He's not in the movie that much, but you can easily sort of imagine reframing the movie around him. And I mean, he never ultimately learns that what happened. You know, he never ultimately learns that he was part of this larger scheme. But like, this is just this absolutely fundamental day for him, where he's discovering all these new things about himself and he's rethinking his entire relationship with his father. And it's just like kind of this quiet emotional breakdown and rediscovery that's going on in the midst of this larger heist where there are really, really high stakes.
Yeah. I just feel like his perspective, I mean, I think he's integral to the story and he's really important. And I do like how his arc kind of mirrors Cobb's in certain ways. But there are certain things that are just funny to me, like the end sequence when they're like gathering their luggage. Can you imagine having this whole elaborate dream with everyone that's in your section of the plane that you've maybe talked to for 2 seconds, and then you see all of them, and they were just in a dream that changed your life. It changed your understanding of your father, of the purpose of your life, what you're doing going forward. And then like you just see them in the airport, and it's like, that's just like really funny to me.
You can imagine it being very like the end of Wizard of Oz, where it's like, I had this dream and you were there and you were there and you were there.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yep.
Okay. The concept of Arthur's fight scene is one of the most innovative, impressive things. And no matter how many behind the scenes things that I watch, I still find it to be flabbergasting that they pulled this off and made it look the way that it did. It blew me away in the theater. It still blows me away now. The first time I saw it, I was absolutely enthralled.
Absolutely stunning. And using techniques that have existed for 50 years, you know, like everyone who has not already, probably a lot of people have heard of this, but if you've not, go look up Royal Wedding, Fred Astaire dance, where Fred Astaire dances on the walls and ceilings. Like, it's the same techniques that were used for that are used for this sequence, but they're just executed so beautifully. And the lighting and the cinematography and the use of camera angles, and
so good. It's
just it looks like nothing you've ever seen before. It holds up so well. And yeah, it's incredible. It's just absolutely iconic. And the physicality too of Joseph Gordon-Levitt, like who would have thought watching him in 500 Days of Summer the year before, like that he could be a convincing action star, but he does great.
Yep. Yeah. And then, so 2 other things. We already kind of touched on this. Hans Zimmer's score, I feel like in the first half of the movie, it's kind of a little bit as subtle as Hans Zimmer can be. But as far as Hans Zimmer goes, the first half of the movie before the mission starts, his score is kind of more subtle in the background, whatever. But then once the mission starts, the moments where it builds and picks up pace and has the ticking of it's just, this movie without this score is not the same movie at all. And I just think it needs to be acknowledged to the upteenth degree. Let's all bow down to Hans Zimmer, because without his score, this movie would not have been as good. I think that it would have been 30% less than what it is. Maybe even more than 30%.
It's like it joins the sort of ranks of, like a Jaws or a Star Wars, where the score is so integral to your emotional experience of the movie. You can't imagine the movie without imagining the sounds that are shaping your experience of it.
Yes. Yep. And then one thing that I love is the production design in the room where Fisher finally comes in and sees his father. The big black
Yeah, sort
tiles.
of 2001-esque, but
Yeah.
black. Yeah.
It's so shiny, so clean, so simple, and yet it communicates so much about the emotion of their relationship and the tension of the scene and the suspense. It's just, even the sound design when that door opens, it's like, it's so, I just love the design of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of, the whole movie is hedging on this one moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's so interesting how everything kind of goes silent and it's black and just pretty much empty, except for the essential things that have to be here and the conversation they have between each other.
Mm-hmm. The visuals we've seen before of the hospital bed and the nightstand, which, by the way, rewatching this last night, I was reminded of something that I was telling you about my experience of watching the movie Nope, which is I
Mm-hmm.
love when a director is able to, throughout a film, seed in visual ideas or line bits of dialogue or sounds or things like that, and give them a kind of ability to serve as a vocabulary. And then by the end, he's able to just, put them back up onto the screen, maybe in a different context, maybe looking a little bit different. But the watcher is immediately able to tell what that means. They're immediately able to decode it. And there are so many things in this movie, in Inception, that are seeded throughout and come up again. There's that view of the children, which is, shown multiple times in many different contexts. There are things like, stepping on a wine glass and the kind of ringing sound it makes, which is used to kind of show, the Cobb's past kind of bleeding in. There's the visual of the wind ruffling the curtains. And one of the things that then makes the Fisher's catharsis scene work so well is that visual of the pinwheel that gets pulled out of and that's just used as this immediate shorthand for this idea that his father actually loves him, and that his relationship with his father is different than the one that he had in his head. And it's just such an elegant way of kind of visually communicating in this one very quick way. And that together, working with the performances, then just gives you everything that you need, and it allows you to just get these ideas. There are very few lines of dialogue spoken, but you just understand everything about what just happened.
And I love the fact that he pulls the pinwheel out of the safe. He doesn't pull out the photo of him as a kid with the pinwheel. He pulls out the pinwheel, which is basically him recreating this memory that he had as a kid that his father was not present for, but it's happening now as an adult, granted in a dream, but it's like he's recreating this memory that he always wanted his dad to be there for.
Yeah, it's like he's going back to childhood, going back to that moment when he felt like he could be with his father.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a very intentional decision, because he could have just taken out the photo, because we've seen that photo a dozen times in the movie. But it's like, no, this moment is different, because he's not reflecting and looking at an old memory. He's recreating it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is super cool.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. I love that.
Well, thank you.
There was one other thing from this section that I wanted to bring up, which I found really interesting on this rewatch that I'd never really noticed before, and I mean, this kind of ties back into what we were talking about how Christopher Nolan's movies are so kind of, there's this sort of sterile intellectual quality to them and to the way that you engage with them, which I'm not saying as a negative. I actually really, really connect with that. But I find it so interesting throughout this movie, the visual language of like big business, and how much of this movie takes place in, hotel rooms or in hallways, or like, a really sterile bar where like a businessman might go and have a drink with a colleague, or, just this idea of like corporate sort of attire that everyone is wearing. Saito, as he's a businessman, he's a Japanese man, and there's that sort of melding between his kind of the visual elements of his culture with the business world is really interesting. And I mean, just the context of the movie, the idea that the whole reason that this plot is able to happen is because of these two huge corporate interests battling with each other, this power struggle that enables this then personal story for Cobb to happen. But then the business interests are kept very vague. And so there is that question of like, this sort of dreamlike quality. To what extent is this actually happening? And this is just sort of Cobb justifying what's going on with him emotionally, or is this actually what is happening? And, Cobb and all these other people are kind of at the whims of these huge corporate interests. I don't know. I just found that sort of idea to set this plot, which is, an action movie set in dreams. Like, you could set that anywhere. You could set it in all sorts of surreal landscapes, but it's set within this sort of kind of cold corporate visual language. I don't know. I was very struck by that. And then too, the third level then is kind of the most adventurous in the setting, because it's the snowy fortress, and it brings up like a lot of like James Bond heists. That's kind of everyone on skis trying to infiltrate a forest is an action sequence that's used a lot in the James Bond movies, which I was very curious about the decision to do that. I mean, I feel like for me, it kind of plays into the idea of like that father-son relationship, because I feel like James Bond is very much a sort of, not a dad franchise and that only dads enjoy it, because I've enjoyed some James Bond movies, but like that's, it's like a lot of fathers and sons might watch a James Bond movie together and enjoy that. And so, it's never stated why they choose that, but is that one of the reasons, because that's kind of an association with Fisher and his relationship with his father? I don't know. I'm just kind of speculating, because I find it very interesting that they do something a bit more outdoorsy and adventurous for that third level and not for the others. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some deep thematic meaning as to why that third layer is more open and cold and adventurous. I can't really think of what it is off the top of my head, but I think that there probably is something very intentional there, because especially even if Christopher Nolan wasn't necessarily thinking about the setting in his writing all that much, although he definitely was. But even just thinking about all the meetings that he had with the production designer and how they specifically chose to have certain things, there definitely is intentionality there, I'm sure. I would just have to think about it more. And I've never thought about it that way. So thank you for pointing that out, because that's a new thing for this movie that I'll have to think about.
Yeah, it only just struck me on this last viewing. I was like, why did they choose this of all settings? Like, and it works so well with what the movie is and what it's doing and the themes that it has. Like, the entire visual language of this movie just is so consistent, and I think that's part of why it works. But I was just fascinated about how those decisions were made and what they mean. Okay. All right, so the last scene of the movie. Cobb successfully enters the United States. He goes through customs. Michael Gaston, the character actor, who I love, is there at the immigration desk to welcome him into the country. He gets to his house and he sets his totem spinning. Then he turns away from it. He sees his kids and he runs to join them. And then the camera focuses in on the top and it wobbles a little, but we cut away before it falls. So there's that question of whether or not Cobb is actually back in the real world or whether he is still dreaming.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Bomb.
Yeah, bomb. Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say that I feel like I'm kind of the odd person out when it comes to the ending of this movie, because I remember when I first watched it, even walking out of the theater, so many people were talking about like, oh my gosh, the spinning top at the end. We didn't get to see it fall. So was it a dream or was it not? And in my mind, I've never cared about that at the end. I've never finished this movie and been like, oh, I really wonder if he's dreaming or if it's the real world. Because I'm kind of like, does it really matter? Because he's chosen this to be his reality anyway. So whether the top falls or not, it is reality because he's chosen it to be. And so many people, they talked about that so much. And that was what they held on to from this movie. And for me, there are so many more things that I took away from this movie than is the top going to fall or is it not? So I don't know if that's just unique to me, but I never really cared about that as much as an ending.
It's funny. I have come to care about it more, weirdly. Like when I first saw it, I was with you. I was like, it's a fun open-ended question, but that's not, I don't really care too much about it. But I feel like as I've reevaluated it more as I get older, the question becomes more important to me, because I feel like a lot of the movie is the um, the question of, as I was saying before, whether you construct your own reality versus living in the reality as it is, as kind of an intentional choice. And the fact that all of Cobb's trauma comes from the fact that his wife refused to accept reality as it was and was determined to construct her own reality. And that led to her downfall, that led to, incredible amount of pain for Cobb. And then throughout the film, he's kind of, at the end of the film, he's basically has a chance to play it again in him rescuing Saito from limbo. Like, Saito is in a place where Maul was, where he has now been in limbo for decades and has completely forgotten about the existence of reality. And so Cobb gets a chance to do it all over and to draw him back into the real world. And so for me, then the question does become a little bit more important to your ultimate takeaway of the movie, because if all of that happens, and yet at the same time Cobb is ignoring his own reality and is choosing to live in something else, that I feel like that says something, or that changes your ultimate takeaway of the movie, or at least it says, it's very revealing about the character of Cobb and how he's processed what he's just gone through.
I see what you're saying, and I do think that that's interesting and really important to the story. I just feel like the top spinning at the end is not necessarily, I don't know. I feel like if he is in a dream, I feel like that's communicated by the fact that his kids, when he sees them, look exactly the same as they did in the memory that he had. I feel like the answer to that question comes from the kids more than it does from the top. Because if the top falls, like, we've already used the totem throughout the entire movie, which in every single other scene, it's fallen. And we're still in that same, maybe we're not, I don't know. But for me, the top does not, to me, every time I watch it, I'm like, of course the top is going to fall, because even if he is dreaming, he's still in the same world that he's been in throughout the entire other parts of the movie. And in all of those other parts, it did fall. So for me, the intrigue of, is he dreaming it or is he not, comes from the fact that the kids look the same age. And if this is a dream, then what does that mean about the totem and how it's fallen throughout the entire movie prior to this? Is the totem broken? Or I don't know.
Yeah,
I
that
just
makes sense. So, like, the totem actually wouldn't work the way it's supposed to, because everything that we've seen before is a dream, and therefore the totem would operate according to dream rules.
Yeah, so I just think the totem itself is not the interesting way to approach that question. But that's just my own personal opinion. If someone disagrees with me, that's fine. It's just, for me, ending on the totem is not. I remember when the movie ended and the totem was there and then it went to black. Everyone was like, oh, what? It ended there? Like, we want to know if the top fell. And I'm like, no, it's fine. The top's going to fall, guys. It's okay. Like, I don't know. Like, the top is not the interesting part here, but okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, so I know I keep saying I'm going to rapid fire do things, but I am going to literally just rapid fire go through all these plot holes one by one. And then if we want to talk about them, we can, or we don't have to.
Okay.
But the first one is, I don't understand the stakes of limbo. If you can literally just kill yourself and come back to reality, then who cares?
Yeah, that's a good one.
If you're already very aware going into limbo that your mind is going to go to mush if you stay there, then why would you not just kill yourself once you immediately get into limbo before you lose your mind? That does not make sense to me. I don't get it. I think that's a huge plot hole. So that's one. Okay, so they all, after the kicks all sync up and they all rise up to the first level, how do they get out of the first level? Because there's no kick that is happening on the plane to bring them out of the first level. And so if it is the argument of, oh, we have to go through the mission and do it as quickly as possible, because if we stay on this level a long time, then his personal army is going to kill us. So what do you do once you all get back here? And then if it's still waited out because there's no way to get you out of the first level, then why don't you all just wait it out instead of going through the mission? Like,
well,
I've seen it. It doesn't make sense.
I've seen it pointed out, and I don't remember where I saw this, but they say that the first level is like a week long. But what we see in the movie could not be more than like 6 hours at the absolute maximum. So does that mean that they wake up on the plane and it's been like half an hour into a 10-hour flight and they're all just like sitting and staring at each other for the next like 9.5 hours?
Oh, God. Yeah, I mean, potentially, yeah. But also, how do they get out of the first level? They never talk about that. If they're going to wait it out, then why would they have gone through the mission? They're going to have to wait it out regardless. Right. It just doesn't. Massive plot hole. It does not make sense. Okay.
Maybe they all just chill on the first level for.
But that doesn't. They literally explicitly stated in the beginning, we can't just sit here and wait for 10 days because we'll be killed by then. That's why we have to do the mission. They established that as a plot point, but then they don't explain. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make
sense.
Okay.
Here's another one. I don't understand why Saito is 1,000,000 years old when Cobb gets to him in limbo, because Cobb went into limbo before Saito did.
Or like, only very shortly afterward.
It doesn't matter, though, because Ariadne, Fisher, and Cobb all went into limbo before Saito died.
I have wondered.
So if you're going through this concept of like, oh, limbo time is longer, whatever, sure, that's fine. But even if that's the case, Cobb should be 1,000,000 years old and Saito should be the young one. Yeah. That does not make sense.
It doesn't.
So that's not necessarily a plot hole. The whole movie doesn't fall apart because of that, but it's a point that annoys me.
I always wonder about these things, like, does Christopher Nolan have some elaborate explanation in his mind? And he was just like, nah, too much. I'm just gonna.
I don't know.
They won't care.
Yeah. That's all my plot holes. That's all I got.
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, like we said before, there are definitely things that you can pick apart about this movie. Like, there's a lot of logic gaps. There are a lot of leaps. There are a lot of things the characters do that don't make sense. And I think, again, the miracle of this movie is, like, there are a lot of weaknesses in the writing, and yet somehow it does work. You know, it's fun, it's exciting, it's emotionally engaging. And I think, again, there is that sort of plausible deniability of the dream context where you can just be like, yeah, but it's a dream. So, you know, of course Ariadne doesn't have much of a character because she's just a projection. So
yeah, so that's all I got.
Yeah, that's pretty much all I've got too. I pulled a couple of critics' quotes about this movie, which I don't really want to go into in depth because I feel like we've really, we've talked about a lot and we do need to wrap this up. But I will just say this movie was very positively received when it first came out. As I mentioned, it was a big hit, but it was also very critically well received. On Metacritic, it's currently at a 74. Rotten Tomatoes has it 87% fresh. I found this quote from a 10-year retrospective by this writer, AJ Romano, on Vox, which I thought was really a really good summary of how I feel about Inception.
I loved this one.
Yeah. So Romano writes, "To me, Inception is a minor miracle, a movie built fundamentally on nonsense, with a terrible script and enough plot holes to be a permanent tease, yet one that satisfies on every conceivable level. No matter how frustrating I find Cobb to be as a character, no matter how weak and implausible I find the writing, every time I watch Inception, by the time he hits the airport and Zimmer's gorgeous Time kicks in on the soundtrack, I'm rooting for him, holding my breath every step, wanting him to get his happy ending despite everything. Most of Inception's plot may be built on nonsense, but a movie that can make you care about all that nonsense and bullshit is the essence of movie making, a Hollywood dream within a Hollywood dream." And I thought that just, yeah. I mean, I would not say it's a terrible script because, as I said before, I think, there's weaknesses in the dialogue and in some of the specific leaps of logic. I think it's still an excellently structured script. But I think Romano sums it up well. Despite those weaknesses, it really is a movie that brings you along with it and allows you to engage with it on the levels of what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with you and with the review as well. And just to throw this out there, Geneva and I both have a love-hate relationship with the Oscars, but just to keep it fun, this film at the Oscars, it won best cinematography, sound mixing, sound editing, and visual effects. And it was nominated for best motion picture, best original screenplay, original score, and art direction. So I would agree with all of those wins and all of those nominations, actually, because even though, like Geneva just said, the screenplay can be a little clunky at times, I think the way that he weaves together all of these incredibly intricate ideas is just incredibly impressive. What an accomplishment. And the production design, I haven't really talked too much about it, but I definitely am very struck by the production design in this movie. I think that it is top notch. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
So, Geneva, why did you pick this movie first to start with?
Well, like I said at the beginning, it's a movie that we both have a history with and care about deeply. And I think it's just, in terms of what moves me about this movie, like I said, I feel like I love the way that this movie really engages my mind. It's not a movie, and most of Christopher Nolan's movies in general, they're not ones that will make me sort of sob or, they're not ones that are sort of emotionally devastating, but they are ones that they engage me and they get me really thinking about them and they get me really invested in what's going on. I care about the characters, even if the characters are, there are weaknesses in the writing, but the casting and the performances that he's able to bring out of his actors often do a lot to make up for it. And it's just a movie that is just, it's so original, it's so fun, it's so moving, it's really endured. This movie it was such a hit at a time, but it's really holds up. And I think it's had a really profound impact on big blockbuster action filmmaking in the last 10 years. But at the same time, it's a movie that no one's really been able to replicate. And I don't think anyone could really replicate it. I mean, Tenet was sort of trying to do similar things, I think far, far less successfully. I don't see a movie like this really coming along again. But it has this really wonderfully universal appeal and timelessness to it that I think is just very special. I think the moment that really, really hits me the hardest is just the ending scene as the mission has been completed and Cobb is walking through the airport. And a lot of that is Hans Zimmer's amazing score. I meant to look up what track is the title of the track that plays during this, and I completely forgot. But whatever track that's playing is just beautiful.
I think it's Time.
Is it Time? Okay, yeah.
I think it might be Time.
Okay, yeah. It is so beautiful. It's just such a great sort of, it makes everything feel very epic and it's very evocative. But then at the same time, again, the moment between Fisher and his father, where that emotional catharsis, that's the one that probably engages me the most on sort of a emotional level. Like that's the quieter sort of human moment that really engages me, whereas the ending scene is the one that just sort of, as a moviegoer, just grabs me and, it sends me out like excited and hopeful and just absolutely thrilled with the experience.
That's awesome. I just looked it up. It is Time, by the way.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, what's the moment that moves you the most?
I think when I think about the moment in this movie that did it for me, I think when I first watched the movie, I think there's two moments. There's the one when the mission actually starts, because I didn't realize that the whole first hour and a half is setup. I was like, I thought that we were already in the movie, not in the intro to the, and then all of a sudden we cut after they go to sleep, we cut and we're in the mission now, in the first layer of the dream world, and it starts with a blah. I think that's when I was like, whoa, this movie is only just beginning. And I didn't know that it would get any better. And I'm so excited for what's coming next. So that's the first moment that I think of. And then the other one is the first time we had the shot of the van falling. When Cobb's character goes, I think someone asks, it might be Eames, who's like, what second kick? And then Cobb is like, when the van hits the water, and then it cuts to the van falling. And like, that was when my heart rate picked up. I don't even know, triple times the pace. I don't even know. But those are the two moments that I remember that really, really did it for me the first time I watched this movie. So yeah, even though Geneva did choose this movie for us this week, like I said in the beginning, this was also on my list to discuss. So I would have put it out there eventually if she hadn't, because this is a movie that impacted both of us a lot. But next week, we will be discussing a movie that was on my list, but was not on Geneva's, which is the amazing, wonderful film by one of the best comedy groups of all time. It is the one and only Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I'm pretty excited about it, and hope you guys will stick around.
Yeah, super excited. I've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I've not seen it for a very long time. I don't remember very well, so super excited to watch it again.
So excited. It's going to be great.
Thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at yourpicpod@gmail.com. Our theme song was composed by Joel Rushton, and our podcast graphic was designed by Kara Shin. If you like this show and want to hear more, please rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We're excited to have you on this journey with us. Until next time.